exactly did your passion for FND come from?
So before coming to Australia, I worked in London primarily at a place called the Maudsley Hospital. That's where I did my initial training. London at that time was one of the few places where they treated FND in a sort of organized fashion. They had a ward called the Lishman Unit at my hospital, which is a neuropsychiatry ward, and they treated all sorts of conditions, but a big chunk of it was FND. And so when in my training, I was interested in neuropsychiatry, not that I'd probably even heard of FND like most people, except maybe in passing at some point in my medical school days. But once I started seeing the patients, I was absolutely fascinated. They were so mysterious, especially back then, and so interesting, really, because they were so little understood. I had come to psychiatry like most psychiatrists, fascinated about the mysteries of the mind and human behavior, and though I'd originally been interested in schizophrenia, as soon as I came across FND, that became the thing that I knew I wanted to work in.
Tell me, what was the attraction to come to Australia, other than this wonderful land that we're on and the wonderful people, of course?
Well, I don't think you can discount that. So before I worked at the Maudsley, I had actually spent 6 months in Perth. Like a lot of British doctors, we certainly in my day, we had a very tough time at the start of our training. I was thinking it was part of the setup. So it was very, very difficult for us. They made us work incredibly long hours under terrible conditions. And so a lot of people came to Australia afterwards to work, but also to get something of a break from the hell of being a junior doctor in the UK. And I came to Perth, and I had a wonderful time, and I really loved it. So it was always in the back of my mind that Australia would be a great place to live. I had to go back to the UK to start my training and to finish my training, but I was always thinking, I want to live somewhere else. And then at a certain point, of course, you, as well as thinking where you want to live, you start to think about your career. And I'd done some traveling around, looking at FND services. We set up an FND service in London, one of the first FND clinics, functional neurology clinic we set up in the Maudsley. And as part of that, I did a sort of world tour looking for similar services around the world, and met with some people who were running clinics in other countries. And then I came to Australia and visited all the places where I expected to find FND services, and I couldn't find any at all.
Wow.
And this was in about 2009. So I knew that there was a gap here in a way. And then when this position became available, in a way, it was an opportunity for me to come here and start doing what I wanted to do in Australia. The reality for most people is that most people with FND is that they spend the first part of their illness journey with neurologists, essentially, because they're trying to figure out what's going on. And they've got this bunch of neurological symptoms, and they spend their time seeing neurologists. And then at a certain point in that journey, once they've got a diagnosis or a suspicion of a diagnosis, the neurologist is usually going to send them to a psychiatrist, or someone else will suggest that they see a psychiatrist. And it's usually at that point that I have got involved. And usually at that point, the neurologist will withdraw and say, you know, I've done my bit, I've diagnosed, now it's over to you. And so the role that I have is one that I kind of, for myself in particular, is one that I kind of set up with the goal of addressing what I thought was one of the fundamental problems with FND, certainly when I started, which was that there was this whole lack of clarity about the diagnosis. And by that, I mean that no one was talking about it. It was this very hidden diagnosis. Time and again, I would see patients who had been ill for decades. They'd seen countless doctors, and yet they'd say, no one's told me what's wrong with me. And you'd think, well, how's that possible? You know, and I've got letters from 20 different doctors who've all told me in their letter what's wrong. How can it be that no one has told you? Everyone was scared of the diagnosis. Everyone was very uncomfortable with the diagnosis. It was a sort of black hole that the patient was inhabiting that seemed to me must make it impossible for them to recover. If they don't know what it is and no one's talking about what it is, how can people be expected to get better? So my goal really when I set up the clinic in London, and the same here in Australia, was to address that by telling the patient essentially what was wrong in as sort of open and facilitated way as possible. So when we set up that first clinic, though it was led by us, we set up a multidisciplinary clinic, so we'd have the neurologist in the clinic with us, and we'd both examine the patient, and then we'd tell the patient together. Maybe, you know, for the first time, it might seem what we thought was happening and what we thought the patient should do.
Wow.
So that seemed like an ideal model, so that there would no longer be any question about what the situation was. The patient couldn't say, well, I'm not sure if my neurologist agrees with my psychiatrist. You know, they've been more interested in this part of it. The psychiatrist is more interested in this. If we're all on the same page and all in the same room talking about the same thing, then hopefully that will provide a firm basis for recovery for the patient, if that sort of doubt or confusion is eliminated.
Very true.
I still think that's the best model. It's quite difficult to arrange that, and we haven't arranged that in Australia, so we don't do that now. We don't have a neurologist in my clinic, though we'd certainly love to have one. So currently, the arrangement I have is I still spend a long time with my patient, giving the diagnosis in as clear and comprehensive a way as I can, and mapping out a plan for patients. And I think the psychiatrist is, to come back to the question of, I mean, that's what happens. What should happen is I think that a psychiatrist is often the best person to do that, because we have more time, and we are often better able to manage all the parts of the patient's difficulties. So certainly in my clinic, it's unusual that we will have someone who's got just a simple FND, if you like. They've just got one symptom, and that's the only problem that they're dealing with. My patients are almost always got a very complicated set of problems. An FND might be only one of them. So putting all of that together is a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. And I think by medical history, the psychiatrists are the people who are used to spending that amount of time trying to figure things out and spending that much time, because most other specialties, they only have 10 minutes for their interviews, and that it's too much.
Yeah, true.
So I'm sure other specialties could do it, but the reality is it's usually us. I would love for neurology to be part of that, and I think it's extremely helpful. But the reality is that for most neurologists, they don't have the time. I don't think my view of what FND has changed in principle over the decades. It's certainly evolved considerably. I think it's a complicated disorder, and I don't think we have a clear understanding of it. So, but I also approached it because I thought it was complex, as I've explained. I thought it was mysterious and interesting, and it remains mysterious and interesting, but also complex. And so my view of it, if you like, on that question of whether it's neurological or psychiatric, it clearly always was both. And I was a neuropsychiatrist, so we're trying to find that middle ground. And I think for many people, that distinction is really a false distinction, because it assumes that there is a difference between those two in a way that I don't think there really is. There is only one brain, and it's the thing that controls everything. Even if we spend all of our time dealing with people's minds, I certainly don't believe that that's a separate organ from the brain. It's we're all dealing with the same person and the same disease in that person. So I think this idea that there's a difference between those two is only if people think that there is some fundamental difference between the mind and the brain, which I don't think there is. So, I mean, there's certainly a difference between what psychiatrists tend to do and what neurologists tend to do with our time and how we approach and manage our patients. But it's a difference of approach. It's not a difference in our understanding of the disorder. So that's always been my view, and I don't think that has changed. There have been some very exciting developments in FND. Some of them have been about our understanding of it. Often I think they are reworkings of old understandings to make them better. But I think that's how science works. I was doing some work on setting the scale of the difference that our patients face in how they are managed by the health system compared with people with epilepsy. People with seizures are essentially treated as having epilepsy, probably, until at the point where they receive a diagnosis and someone says, actually, I think these are not epileptic seizures, they're something else. Up until that point, there's a sort of whole treatment system, a whole bunch of doctors whose job it is to look after them, a whole set of treatment centers, nurses, allied health, hundreds of drugs that have been developed over hundreds of years, a whole system around treating people with epilepsy. And at the point where they get diagnosed with something else, all of that falls away and they are left with not very much. Depending, of course, on where they live, but suddenly the amount of treatment options that they have rapidly changes, but also the sort of evidence about what should happen to them also is dramatically different. So we looked at the number of clinical trials that there are for epilepsy, and as you can imagine, there are lots. There are 400 at the moment registered, whereas you and I know in non-epileptic seizures or functional seizures, there's only ever really been one of any size ever. And the COACH trial in London, in the UK. So the scale of evidence is just completely different for epilepsy and for functional seizures, even though they're such similar conditions in so many ways. So what's exciting about this is it's hopefully the second treatment study that's conducted on a large scale for functional seizures. And I don't know, there may be others out there that I don't know about, and there certainly have been plenty of other smaller trials, but this will be a large, hopefully, multi-center, multinational treatment trial. Australia has taken a sort of lead, unusually, on psychedelic treatments worldwide, which is probably controversial, but something that we've been thinking about for a while is whether the use of psychedelics might augment treatment for FND. And that was sort of really a hypothetical idea. We thought it could, but it'd be so difficult to try and do any research in that area that we kind of parked it. But then the world of psychedelic treatment generally in psychiatry has just exploded, as you've probably heard in the last few years. And there's been an organization in Australia that has been incredibly effective, really, in lobbying the government and persuading them to give money to it, and just recently to changing the laws around psychedelic prescribing in Australia. So I think Australia is the first country where they have now made it legal for psychiatrists to prescribe psychedelic drugs to patients with certain conditions. Not FND, but with certain other conditions. But we have returned to the idea that we hypothesized a while ago, that giving people psychedelic drugs would augment their physiotherapy. So looking at people who've already had physiotherapy for their movement disorder, their functional movement disorder, and who haven't recovered, the idea would be that physiotherapy would essentially relax the grip that the FND has over their movement, and allow them to have their movement retrained. So it's fair to say it's never been tried, as far as we know, on anyone ever in the world. So it really will be a first for us, as for everyone. And we were surprised and delighted that the government was willing to fund this study, which they were. And we've just started now, but we're sort of trying to catch up. We're going to pilot it this year. We'll be looking for our first participants some healthy controls and some people with FND as well to be our first subjects for the study.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting study to be a part of.
Another one I would mention is, I guess, one that I'm excited about is the Spect Study, because I think it's one of the more difficult things to study, is trying to look at what happens during a functional seizure, because it's so difficult to study, because the patient's obviously in an altered state, if you like, during their seizure. They can't usually really explain what's going on, and it's quite hard to study it with imaging or something like that, because patients are having seizures. So it's very difficult to understand what's happening during a seizure. We've got lots of theories, and we've had them for a long time, about what the patient might be experiencing, but there's a sort of big gap there in our knowledge, which seems hard to fill, because the patient will always struggle, I guess, to explain what's happening, because they're, because of what's happening to them.
Yeah.
So this study is using the way that people with functional seizures get their diagnosis in many cases is because they go to this video EEG suite somewhere in a hospital, and they have this video recording of them made whilst they're having their EEG, and then hopefully they have a seizure, and then the doctors will look at that and say, okay, look, you were having a seizure, but your EEG didn't show epilepsy at this time. So we know it's not epilepsy, so we can conclude that it's a non-epileptic seizure or a functional seizure. But something else that they do during these is, because they're monitoring the patient 24 hours a day, hoping to see one of these seizures, is they sometimes do a certain kind of brain imaging called a Spect scan. And they do that because they want to find out, for their people with epilepsy, which part of the brain is the part that's causing the epilepsy, the epileptic focus, as they call it. And they're interested in that because for some people with epilepsy, you can actually cut that part out of their brain, and hopefully they will recover or stop having epilepsy. So what they do is, because the patient's being monitored 24 hours a day, as soon as they see the patient with epilepsy having a seizure, they inject them with what they call a tracer at the time they're having their seizure. And then that travels around into their blood and goes to all the bits of the brain that are super active at that time. And then they scan them after the seizure's finished, an hour later or something. They scan them, and that tracer is still stuck to the bits of the brain that were active during a seizure. And then they can say, look, this is the epileptic focus in your brain. This is the part that's most active during your seizure, so that's the bit that we can cut out. What we're going to do in our study is use that same system, because our patients are already there. They're there to get their diagnosis, but they already have this system set up to do these Spect scans on them. So we will be doing these Spect scans on our patients as well during their seizures. So what we'll find out is which parts of their brain are most active when they're having a seizure. So sure, maybe that would be the bits that control their movements if they're moving around, but hopefully it will be other parts of their brain as well. We'll be able to say, look, it's a bit of your brain that is involved with feeling scared, or remembering something from your past, or feeling out of control, or whatever it is that might be going on and that we really don't know about. Hopefully that will show us for the first time.
Is there any one research that you've had an aha moment or favourite, I guess I'm asking, that you have worked on?
Many favorites, like my children. You know, you invest so much in your projects.
Right.
I spent a lot of time talking to neurologists about FND in the beginning, trying to understand their thinking about it. That was very revealing for me. I'm not sure that I found something that I didn't expect, but it was an extremely interesting and important process for me. I suppose the one that has probably been the most important study for me has been the one that we did looking at life events in people with motor symptoms who were coming to my clinic. And we got Tim Nicholson and Selma Ibeck were the people who did all the work for that. So we set up the project, but they were the ones who were interviewing the patients and doing the scans on them. But what was interesting about that study for me was that really the results of it, in that we found that for these patients who I'd seen all of them because they'd all come through my clinic, and I'd asked everyone about their lives and so on. And yet what we found from doing this research interview, which asked people about their lives in much more detail and in much, really with much more time than even I would have as a psychiatrist asking them in their clinic, how much more we found. So that we found that there were things which may or may not have been important, but which certainly seemed like they could be for most people, that their symptoms hadn't started out of the blue, that something had seemed to precipitate it. So that was, I guess, unexpected, because I'd asked everyone already, and only a minority had we ever found that people had said, oh, you know, they started because of, my symptoms started because I was going through a divorce or whatever. I just had this medical scare or something had happened, and then my symptoms started from that point. We'd only found that in a minority of people. But when we interviewed people at length, we found that most people had something like that around the time that their symptoms had started. And then when we scanned them, we were able to find that the way they thought about those events was different from how they thought about their other events, that they seemed to be special for them in a way as well. So it was, I guess it changed the way I felt about it. We were all familiar with that idea that can happen, but I guess what was important for me about that study was the scale at which it was happening. It certainly wasn't everyone, but we found really that if we looked very hard and hard enough, that we could find something like that going on for a much larger group of people, that lots of people were having that kind of story. I want to say, first of all, that I think when you asked me about what am I thinking about FND has changed over the years, and it hasn't. But I think the experience of working in FND has changed enormously because there is so much more awareness, and that awareness is so much better than the awareness that there was before. The existence of FND Hope. For the first 10 years in which I was working in FND, there was no FND Hope or any organization like it, and there was a complete absence of information. You know, John started his neurosymptoms.org to try and create some a repository of safe information for people, and I spent a lot of my time working on Wikipedia, trying to create a Wikipedia page that would give useful information to people, because there was nothing else. And nobody had ever heard of it. People would come to us and say, this is what it is. And we'd say, well, I've looked on the internet and there's nothing on there. There's or there's something written by someone who, you know, is just furious about this diagnosis and thinks that it's all made up or something like that. So it was, you know, very unhelpful for people to try to read that. So there was this terrible lack of awareness, certainly amongst the general public, but also amongst doctors as well. And that has really changed enormously over the past 20 years. It's been transformed so that the experience that I have of working in my clinic was often quite difficult to begin with, because people would come to the clinic, like I said, often not having been given the diagnosis, but never having heard of it, or if they had, they thought it was something terrible. They thought this was the worst diagnosis, that this was something shameful, that their doctors were thought very little of, or were you know, laughing about, or something like that. So it was a terrible thing, and so people were often very unhappy about being given the diagnosis because of what it seemed to mean. That has really changed enormously in the time that I've been working in the field. So people come to my clinic now excited to get the diagnosis. They've already read about it. They're already usually in touch with organizations such as yourselves, so they come prepared and aware. And it's almost never the case now that I'm telling them something that they've never heard of, or that they don't, or that they are worried about getting a diagnosis on. So that has been wonderful. And of course, all it means is that FND is now a much more normal disorder. I think that's been the big change, is it's become much more normal within medicine in how it is seen and managed. And that is of incalculable benefit for patients, also for me working with patients. So that has already been a huge achievement in the field. And hopefully we can all take some credit from that, certainly you guys, but the people who've been working in the field as well. It's been terrific. But we still haven't made the progress that I think we need to make in treatment. So whilst there are lots of exciting studies going on about different treatment options, like I said, that gulf in the amount of research remains enormous for FND. And it's the area where we all have to work harder. And as you've discovered, Dee, and I guess I've discovered as well, it's really hard work. Doing a big study, a big treatment trial takes years and a lot of money, and it's hard work. So it's not something that can be done just with enthusiasm and interest. It requires really sustained effort and money and organization and institutional support as well, governmental support or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's where we have to go if we're going to try and close that gap. It has to be the future. The most gratifying part about working in this field is seeing the way that the reception of the disorder has changed, and that owes an enormous part of it to the work of organizations such as FND Hope.